The sun was setting over the peaceful town of Pine Valley, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Anderson wrapped up another demanding day. His chambers were quiet now, the usual bustle of legal proceedings replaced by the gentle hum of his desk lamp. He gathered his worn leather briefcase, filled with case files he planned to review over the weekend, a habit he'd maintained throughout his 15 years on the bench. The courthouse janitor, Mr. Lee, gave him a warm smile as he walked past. "Another late night, Your Honor?" he asked, leaning on his mop. The judge paused, sharing a friendly moment with the man who'd been keeping the courthouse spotless for over 2 decades. They often chatted about their grandchildren during these evening encounters. "You know how it is, Frank," the judge replied with a tired smile. "Justice doesn't keep regular hours." They'd both chuckled at the familiar exchange. The judge had always believed in treating everyone with the same respect, whether they wore a suit or carried a mop. It was this quality that had earned him deep respect throughout Pine Valley. As he walked to his car in the nearly empty parking lot, he could see the last streaks of orange and purple painting the sky. His black Mercedes wasn't flashy, just a reliable car he'd bought after years of saving. The judge had never been one for showing off, preferring to let his work speak for itself. His wife had always teased him about being too modest, but that's just who he was. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from the courthouse gardens. He loosened his bow tie, a gift from his daughter on his last birthday, and slipped into the driver's seat. The leather interior still had that new car smell, mixed with the aroma of the coffee he'd spilled last week while rushing to an early morning hearing. Instead of taking his usual route home, he decided to drive through Maple Street. The judge loved this part of town, with its historic houses and tall oak trees that had witnessed generations of Pine Valley's history. His own grandfather had once worked as a gardener for some of these houses, back when the town's divisions ran deep. Now, as one of the town's most respected figures, he often reflected on how far things had come, and how far they still had to go. As he drove, his mind wandered to the civil rights case he'd just finished presiding over. It had been a complex one, involving workplace discrimination at the local factory. The evidence had been clear, but what struck him most was how subtle modern prejudice could be, hidden behind paperwork and procedures rather than the overt actions of the past. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on, creating pools of light on the empty sidewalks. Through his open window, he could hear the distant sound of children playing in their yards, parents calling them in for dinner, and the occasional bark of a neighborhood dog. These everyday sounds of community life always brought him peace after a long day of making difficult decisions. He checked his watch, almost 7:30. His wife would be waiting with dinner, probably his favorite pot roast since it was Friday. They had a standing date night tradition, even after 30 years of marriage. He smiled, thinking about how she'd tease him for working late again, but would have his slippers ready and a glass of iced tea waiting. The judge was just about to turn onto Cedar Lane when he noticed a patrol car in his rearview mirror. He automatically checked his speed, exactly at the limit as always. His turn signal was on, his lights were working, and his tags were current. There was no reason for concern, yet decades of experience make him straighten his posture and place both hands firmly on the steering wheel. Old habits died hard, even for a judge. Little did he know that this routine evening was about to become anything but routine. The flash of red and blue lights in his mirror would mark the beginning of an incident that would change not just his life, but the entire fabric of Pine Valley's community. The police cruiser had been parked in the shadow of a large oak tree, its 2 officers finishing their coffee when they spotted the black Mercedes. Officer Wilson, fresh out of the academy, nudged his partner. "That's an expensive car for this time of night," he said, crumpling his paper cup. His partner, Officer Chen, a 12-year veteran of the force, was already starting the engine. They'd pulled out slowly, keeping a careful distance as they'd followed the Mercedes. The car was moving exactly at the speed limit, signaling properly at every turn, and staying perfectly centered in its lane. Even the brake lights were working perfectly. Still, something didn't sit right with the younger officer. Maybe it was the way the driver sat so stiffly, or how the car took the long way around the neighborhood. "Run the plates," Officer Chen said, maintaining a steady distance. The response came back clean. The car was registered to a Pine Valley address, purchased 3 months ago, all paperwork in order. But Wilson had already made up his mind. "Let's just make sure everything's okay," he said, reaching for the light bar switch. The red and blue lights shattered the peaceful evening. The Mercedes responded perfectly, signaling and pulling over smoothly onto a well-lit stretch of road. The driver's movements were deliberate and calm, almost too calm, Wilson thought. He'd been taught that such calmness could be suspicious. "I'll take the lead on this one," Wilson said, adjusting his belt as he stepped out of the cruiser. Chen followed, flashlight in hand, maintaining his position slightly behind the Mercedes' rear window. The autumn air had grown chilly, and their breath formed small clouds in the beam of the flashlight. As they approached, they could see the driver's hands placed carefully at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The interior light was on. Another textbook move that somehow made Wilson more suspicious rather than less. Through the tinted rear window, they could make out an empty back seat and what looked like a briefcase on the floor. Wilson approached the driver's side while Chen stood ready, his hand resting near his holster, standard procedure, though something about this stop felt different. The driver's window was already rolling down, smooth and steady, revealing a man in what was clearly an expensive suit, a bow tie. Who even wore bow ties anymore? "License and registration," Wilson demanded, his voice carrying more edge than he'd intended. He noticed a slight tremor in his own hand as he held the flashlight. This was only his third traffic stop without a training officer, and something about the situation had him on edge. "Of course, officer," the driver replied, his voice steady and clear. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my inner jacket pocket, and then I'll get the registration from the glove compartment. Is that acceptable?" The measured tone and careful words somehow made Wilson even more tense. Nobody he'd stopped before had been this composed. "Just move slowly," Wilson snapped, the beam of his flashlight following every movement. He could hear Chen shifting his position slightly, responding to the tension in his voice. The driver's hands moved with exaggerated slowness, making every motion obvious and telegraphed. The wallet emerged from the jacket pocket, expensive leather, Wilson noted. The registration followed from the glove compartment, presented with the same deliberate care. Not a single rushed or unexpected movement. The driver handed over both items with steady hands, though Wilson noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. The only sign that this wasn't just another routine moment in his day. As Wilson took the documents, his flashlight beam caught the glint of something on the driver's lapel. A pin of some sort. In the back of his mind, a warning bell started to ring. He'd seen pins like that before, during his academy graduation. His fingers fumbled slightly as he opened the wallet, and then the world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis as he read the identification inside. The night suddenly felt much colder, and Wilson became acutely aware of every sound: the idle of the patrol car's engine, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze, and most of all, the pounding of his own heart in his ears. Because there, in clear official lettering, was a title he hadn't expected to see on this quiet evening patrol: the Honorable Judge. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Wilson's flashlight beam trembled slightly as it illuminated the judge's credentials, the golden courthouse badge gleaming accusingly in the harsh light. His throat felt dry, and the crisp autumn air suddenly seemed much colder than it had moments ago. From the driver's seat, the judge watched both officers through his side mirror, his hands still placed firmly on the steering wheel. He'd been in this situation before, too many times to count. Each time he felt the same mix of emotions: frustration, wariness, and a deep, professional calm that came from years of managing high-pressure situations in his courtroom. "Is there a problem with my documents, officer?" the judge asked, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used when addressing nervous witnesses in his courtroom. He could see Officer Chen shifting uncomfortably in his peripheral vision, while Officer Wilson seemed frozen in place, still staring at the ID as if hoping the words might somehow rearrange themselves. The crickets chirped in the nearby bushes, and somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. These ordinary sounds felt amplified in the tense silence. A bead of sweat rolled down Officer Wilson's temple despite the cool evening air. His training hadn't prepared him for this particular situation. "Your Honor, Wilson started, then stopped, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "We received reports of suspicious activity in the area." The lie felt hollow even as he said it, and they all knew it. There had been no such reports. The judge took a slow, deep breath. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with these encounters. His bow tie felt tight around his neck, but he resisted the urge to adjust it. Years of experience had taught him that even the smallest movement could escalate situations like this. "Would you mind telling me what seemed suspicious about my driving, officer?" the judge asked quietly. "I believe I was following all traffic regulations." His voice remained steady, but carried a weight that made both officers acutely aware of who they were dealing with. Officer Chen stepped forward slightly, his flashlight beam dropping to the ground. "Your Honor, perhaps we should," he began, but Wilson cut him off with a sharp gesture. The younger officer's pride was now wrestling with his growing realization of the situation. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Wilson demanded, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. Chen's head snapped around to stare at his partner in disbelief. This was rapidly spinning out of control. The judge's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. In his mind, he was already composing the conversation he would need to have with the police chief tomorrow. But for now, he had to manage this moment, this young officer who was letting fear and pride override his judgment. "Officer Wilson," the judge said, reading the nameplate on his uniform. "I want you to think very carefully about your next words." His tone wasn't threatening. Rather, it carried the same patient authority he used when guiding nervous young lawyers through their first court appearances. A car passed by slowly on the other side of the street, its headlights sweeping across the scene. The brief illumination showed the tableau in stark relief. The judge, still seated with perfect posture in his Mercedes. Officer Wilson, rigid with tension and uncertainty, and Officer Chen, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. The judge continued, his voice remaining calm and measured. "I've spent 15 years on the bench in this town. I've sworn in many of your colleagues. I've probably signed warrants for you. And right now, you're about to make a decision that will affect not just this moment, but your entire career. So, I'm going to give you what I give everyone who appears in my courtroom. A chance to step back, think clearly, and make the right choice." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. In the distance, a police siren wailed, heading somewhere else, dealing with some other crisis. But here, in this moment, 3 men stood frozen in a tableau of modern America, each knowing that what happened next would ripple far beyond this quiet street corner. The silence that followed the judge's words felt endless. Officer Wilson's hands trembled slightly as he looked down at the ID again, the gold courthouse badge seeming to mock him in the beam of his flashlight. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. Officer Chen stepped forward, gently placing a hand on his partner's shoulder. "Wilson," he said quietly, "stand down." The younger officer's shoulders slumped slightly, his flashlight beam finally dropping away from the judge's face. The night seemed to hold its breath. The radio on Chen's shoulder crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the tension. "Unit 247, status check." Chen reached up and pressed the button, his eyes never leaving his partner. 247 here. All clear. Routine traffic stop concluding now." The word routine felt like sandpaper in his mouth. Inside the Mercedes, the judge remained perfectly still, hands on the wheel. He'd seen this moment before, from the other side of his bench. That instant when reality crashes into preconception, when assumptions crumble and truth stands naked in the harsh light of consequence. He'd sentenced many men in his courtroom, but sometimes the most powerful sentences were the ones left unspoken. Wilson cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. "Your Honor," he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. The courthouse pin on the judge's lapel caught the light as he turned slightly, waiting. Wilson had seen that pin before, during his swearing-in ceremony just 6 months ago. Had the judge been there that day? He couldn't remember now, his memories blurred by the rushing of blood in his ears. "Perhaps," the judge said softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of similar experiences, "we should discuss why you really pulled me over tonight." It wasn't a question. In his rearview mirror, he could see Officer Chen wincing slightly, already anticipating tomorrow's headlines. A dog barked in a nearby yard, making Wilson jump slightly. His hand had dropped away from his weapon, his posture deflating as the reality of the situation fully sank in. This wasn't just any traffic stop gone wrong. This was the kind of mistake that could define a career, that could become a cautionary tale told in police academies for years to come. "Your Honor," Chen stepped forward, his voice professional but tinged with genuine regret. "We apologize for the inconvenience. You're free to go, of course." He gestured to his partner to step back, trying to salvage what he could from the situation. But the judge didn't reach for his ignition. Instead, he turned fully in his seat, fixing both officers with a gaze that had made countless witnesses reconsider their testimony. "Officer Wilson," he said, his tone measured and clear, "tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I'd like you to come to my chambers. Not for punishment," he added, seeing the young officer's face pale further, "but for a conversation that I think we both need to have." Wilson nodded stiffly, unable to find his voice. The judge continued, "And Officer Chen, I'd appreciate it if you would join us. Your experience might be valuable to the discussion." Chen's "Yes, Your Honor" was quiet but firm. The judge finally reached for his seatbelt, the click seeming unusually loud in the night air. "One more thing," he said, his hand on the gearshift. "When you make it back to the station tonight, I want you both to think about something. Think about how this stop would have ended if I hadn't been wearing this robe earlier today. If I didn't have this pin on my lapel. If I was just another citizen driving home on a quiet evening." The words settled over the scene like autumn leaves, gentle but carrying the weight of undeniable truth. The judge's engine hummed to life, the soft purr of German engineering breaking the spell of silence. As he prepared to drive away, he saw in his mirror both officers standing still, their postures suggesting men who had just glimpsed a truth about themselves they couldn't unsee. News travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves one of its most prominent figures. By sunrise, whispers of the previous night's incident had already reached the courthouse steps. The morning cleaning crew exchanged quiet conversations as they polished the brass railings. Court clerks huddled around their coffee cups, their usual morning chatter replaced by concerned murmurs. The judge arrived at his usual time, 7:30 am sharp, carrying his worn leather briefcase and a thermos of his wife's coffee. If last night's incident weighed on him, it didn't show in his steady stride or straight shoulders. The security guard at the entrance, a retired police officer himself, gave him a long look filled with unspoken understanding. "Morning, Your Honor," the guard said, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Heard about last night?" The judge paused, offering a small smile that carried years of patience. "Just another evening in Pine Valley," he replied, though they both knew it was anything but. Inside his chambers, the morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the dark wood paneling. The judge hung his coat carefully, straightened the family photos on his desk, and settled into his morning routine. But before he could open his first case file, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Chief Richardson and Mayor Thompson. The chief's face was drawn with concern, his uniform pressed extra crisp as if preparing for battle. The mayor, usually quick with a smile and a handshake, looked like she hadn't slept. They both stood awkwardly until the judge gestured to the leather chairs facing his desk. "Your Honor," the chief began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, "I can't begin to express." The judge held up a hand, stopping the rehearsed apology in its tracks. The morning sun caught the courthouse pin on his lapel, the same one that had reflected police flashlights the night before. "Before we begin," the judge said, pulling out a thick folder from his desk drawer, "I'd like you both to look at something." He opened the folder carefully, revealing neat stacks of papers, each one a documented traffic stop. 15 years on the bench, he continued, his voice steady. 23 routine traffic stops. Same car, same neighborhood, same careful driving. Different officers, same assumptions. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in her chair as the judge laid out paper after paper. Each report told the same story. Suspicious vehicle, routine check, no citations issued. The dates spanned his entire career on the bench, right up to last night's incident. "I don't want apologies," the judge said, closing the folder gently. "I want change." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of decades of similar conversations. The chief's hand, resting on his knee, tightened into a fist, then relaxed. The mayor leaned forward, her political instincts kicking in. "We could issue a public statement, set up a commission, she began, but the judge shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "With all due respect, Mayor," he said, standing to look out his window at the courthouse square below, "we don't need another commission or statement. What we need is honest conversation and real action." He turned back to face them, his expression thoughtful. "And I think last night's incident gives us that opportunity." The morning bustle of the courthouse filtered through his office door, the shuffle of papers, the murmur of voices, the steady rhythm of justice in motion. But in his chambers, time seemed to stand still as the judge outlined his vision for something more meaningful than apologies. "Officer Wilson and Chen will be here at 9, he said, checking his watch. "I've asked them to share their perspective on last night's events. Not for punishment," he added, seeing the chief straighten in his chair, "but for understanding. Because what happened last night isn't just about me, or those officers, or even this town. It's about the difference between what we say we believe and what our actions show we believe." A gentle breeze stirred the American flag outside his window, its reflection visible in the polished surface of his desk. The judge's words carried the quiet authority that had made him legendary in Pine Valley's legal circles. "Sometimes," he continued, "the most important cases we try aren't in the courtroom at all." 5 years had passed since that night on Cedar Lane. The judge sat in his chambers, looking through the window at the autumn leaves dancing across the courthouse square. His hair had a bit more gray now, but his eyes still carried the same determined spark. On his desk lay a newspaper article with the headline, "Pine Valley Police Department receives national recognition for community relations program." He smiled, remembering how it all started with a traffic stop and 2 officers who could have become symbols of the problem, but instead became part of the solution. The training program they'd created together had grown beyond anyone's expectations. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, and Officer Wilson, now Sergeant Wilson, entered, followed by Officer Chen, recently promoted to lieutenant. They weren't the same men who had stood nervously in this office 5 years ago. Experience had changed them, but so had understanding. "Your Honor," Wilson said, pulling up a chair without waiting for an invitation, a sign of how their relationship had evolved. "The new batch of recruits just finished their community training session. You should have seen them. One of them actually cried when Mrs. Johnson told her story about being afraid to drive her grandkids to school." The judge nodded, remembering the elderly woman who had become one of their most powerful speakers. Her quiet dignity and honest words had touched hundreds of officers over the years. "And how are the statistics looking?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Chen pulled out his tablet, swiping through screens of data. "Traffic stops based on suspicious behavior are down 78% since we started the program. Civilian complaints are down 65%. But here's the really interesting part. Our arrest rates for serious crimes are actually up. Turns out, when officers aren't distracted by unnecessary stops, they're better at catching real criminals." The autumn sun streamed through the window, catching the courthouse pin on the judge's lapel, the same one that had reflected police flashlights on that fateful night. But now it wasn't just his pin. Every graduate of their program received one, a reminder of where this journey began. "Remember that first training session?" Wilson asked, shaking his head with a smile. "I was so nervous I could barely speak. But then you told us about your grandfather, Your Honor. About how he used to say that change doesn't happen in big moments, it happens in small choices, one person at a time." The judge stood up, walking to the wall where photographs now chronicled their journey. Pictures of community meetings, training sessions, graduation ceremonies. Faces of officers and citizens, young and old, all part of the change they'd created together. "You know what makes me proudest?" the judge said, turning back to face them. "It's not the awards or the recognition. It's what I see when I drive home at night now. I see our officers talking with kids in the park, helping elderly residents with their groceries, being part of the community instead of just policing it." Chen nodded, understanding. "The other day, my daughter asked me why I became a police officer. I told her about this program, about what we learned here. She said she wants to be an officer too someday. 5 years ago, that would have worried me. Now it makes me proud." The conversation was interrupted by another knock. A young officer stood in the doorway, fresh-faced and earnest. "Sorry to interrupt, Your Honor, but the new cadets are ready for your speech." The judge smiled, gathering his notes. Some stories needed to be told again and again. As they walked together through the courthouse halls, the judge thought about all the lives touched by what had grown from that one night. The program had spread to neighboring towns, then to other states. What started as a confrontation had become a conversation, and that conversation had become a movement. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying away the last of summer's warmth. But inside the hearts of those gathered in the training room, a different kind of warmth glowed. The warmth of hope, of progress, of small changes adding up to something bigger than themselves. The judge looked out at the sea of faces, veteran officers and fresh recruits, community leaders and civilian volunteers, all waiting to hear him speak, all part of this ongoing story. He cleared his throat and began as he always did. Let me tell you about a night 5 years ago when 2 officers made a traffic stop, and we all learned that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding.